Start with your anniversary. A lot of cheers. You received various ones, and there was even a marathon of your wonderful poems. Did you manage to see and read everything? Maybe? Did you manage to respond to everyone at all?
You know, I am, in principle, very touched by what I heard, saw, and received through various channels of information delivery. And I want to say thank you to each one. But it's impossible to do so. Therefore, by the way, we are meeting today. And before moving on to the political part of our conversation, I would like, with your permission and the permission of Channel 1, whose kind services we regularly use, to express my gratitude to all those who remembered this, my anniversary, who not only called and congratulated me, but in fact truly put their heart into reciting my humble, poetic works, and subsequently added their own creative touches, I believe. Lyrical, humorous, and many others. Of course, I am especially grateful to the President for the high appraisal of my work, to the Prime Minister, and to the leadership of the Federal Assembly. Ministers, my colleagues, deputies, and senators. The heads of mass media, including, of course, Channel 1 and our other partners, Russia 1, Russia 24, TVC, NTV, channels where we often, our ministry, appear and convey to our citizens the essence of what is happening in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and what we are striving for on the international stage. I was very pleased with the congratulations from TNT, where I was not invited, but nevertheless, they congratulated me. And the leaders of sports movements, civil society, in its various forms. Of course, my colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Well, it's impossible to list everyone. I definitely have materials. I have a very thick folder on my desk and a lot on my phone. Materials, I will definitely, when I have a free moment, definitely and with pleasure, take a look. But taking this opportunity, I want to thank through you all those who acknowledged and noted anniversary.
Sergey Viktorovich, the negotiations in Ariadne, an important question: what was their task and how did they conclude? Please comment.
The negotiations concluded today with the fact that the preliminary results achieved that are now being reported to the President of Russia and the President of the United States. They discussed there, as agreed, by Putin and Tarasov, Trump, primarily the issues of safe navigation in the Black Sea. And this is not the first attempt. The first attempt was back in July 2022, as is known, when the UN Secretary General, together with Turkish President Erdogan, mediated. And with specialists representing Ukrainian and Russian entities, the corresponding structures agreed on a package. The package consisted of two parts. The first part is ensuring simplified methods for delivering Ukrainian grain through the Black Sea via the straits with ship inspections to ensure there is no fraud, and that, if grain is declared, that the grain is delivered to the destination where it is supposed to be delivered. An empty trip for a new batch of grain was not used. Inspection procedures for the delivery of weapons were agreed upon, and they operated for a whole year. But after that, we were forced to halt this process, at least take a pause for now, because the second part of the package, which was an integral part of the package, was simply sabotaged 100%. It turned out that it was absolutely necessary to remove all obstacles to the export of Russian grain and fertilizers. This was related to the inclusion of all ships transporting Russian agricultural products, including fertilizers in essence, the prohibited lists. Lloyd's, the company that insures these ships, raised the rates. To be continued, the transfer of money, more money for the supply of our products was also hindered. Bank was disconnected from SWIFT. There were many things that just... It turned out to be aimed at driving up prices. When European farmers were probably creating for themselves a situation of unfair competition, but at the same time, the bias of our Western colleagues was evident in the fact that Ukrainian grain was dumped onto European markets, even though its quality was far from meeting the existing criteria in this area. In general, the West did everything to protect Ukraine in every possible way as much as possible and hold the Russian Federation accountable as much as possible. And so when the General Secretary, a year after the Black Sea Initiative was in effect, shrugged and said he couldn't make it work, we said that when we succeed, we will return to this deal. We simply withdrew from the Ukrainian part, which was approved for a year. The year ended and we did not extend this deal. The Russia-UN memorandum about removing all obstacles to the export of Russian grain and fertilizers, which constitute much more a share in the global markets than the Ukrainian one, this memorandum was valid for 3 years and continues to be in effect until July of this year. The General Institute Guterres, his representatives, are constantly in contact with us. They try to help somehow, but they are looking for ways not through the principled lifting of sanctions, demanding from the West. If the West truly wants to care for the interests of developing countries, for the interests of the global majority, especially in Africa, in the field of food security, then discriminatory measures should be lifted. But General Stalin took a different path. He decided to look for loopholes in those sanctions, which the West imposed without demanding their removal, and, moreover, in essence, respecting and complying with these sanctions, which for an official of the UN, for any UN official, and especially for the Secretary General, is absolutely unacceptable, because it is stated in the Charter that no member of the UN Secretariat, including, of course, the Secretary General and their deputy, has the right to receive instructions from any government. If the Secretary General is looking for loopholes between the sanctions, acknowledging that they exist, he is implementing decisions that were made in capitals, where there are governments of UN member states, and he does not have the right to do this. Therefore, our negotiators, who were appointed by President Putin in Riyadh, reminded their American colleagues of this entire history and said that, considering the track record, well, and of Ukraine itself, of course, but also of this entire Black Sea story, we would like this time for there to be no ambiguities. There should be none. They also reminded that when in 2023 we exited, well, the Ukrainian part of the initiative expired, we withdrew from it. After that, President Erdogan tried to renew it 2 or 3 times. Moreover, to renew it a year ago, he very much asked for our support. In order to renew this initiative in a simplified form, without physical inspections of empty ships returning after unloading grain and fertilizers, and we were even ready to agree to this. Then, at the last moment, Erdogan said, this was a year ago, that Zelensky wants to also agree on not striking nuclear infrastructure facilities. Although it was Zelensky himself who was striking the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But since this proposal came from Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, we agreed to it in the city of. Moreover, without any special verification mechanisms. That is, we went along with all the requests of President Erdogan and with the request that Erdogan himself slipped in at the last moment from Zelensky. It's unclear for what purpose. And we said yes, and then Erdogan called Putin and said, Zelensky changed his mind. Now, taking into account all these changes of mind, considering that every time when suddenly a ceasefire is announced and Ukraine agrees to it solely because at the specific historical moment in question, Ukraine found itself in a hopeless situation on the battlefield. And as soon as a pause occurred, immediately, within weeks or a couple of months, this ceasefire was grossly violated. This was the case throughout the entire duration of the Minsk agreements. Therefore, we now need the clearest, most specific, verifiable, and effective guarantees and mechanisms. As President Putin said at the press conference with President Lukashenko a few days ago, that he supports the initiative of President Trump about declaring a moratorium on strikes declaring a 30-day ceasefire, not only strikes on energy infrastructure or on maritime infrastructure in the Black Sea, but a general 30-day ceasefire. I said that we are in favor, but considering the length of this line, considering the capabilities of the Ukrainian military to create provocations, they have now struck at the court regarding the gas pumping station, and they said that Russia did it themselves. Although this is our own property, on which the continuation of supply largely depends. With energy for a number of European countries. Currently, it is impossible to do this, just as it is impossible to use the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, which reflects the interests of businesses in Kazakhstan and the United States, and one of its pumping stations, Kropotkinskaya, was attacked. And this damage cannot be quickly repaired. That is, once again, the volumes of oil pumping for European consumers will sharply decrease due to another terrorist act by the Ukrainians. Therefore, from President Lavrov, we are due to the truce, but there are nuances who will ensure the integrity of the Nazi regime in Kyiv. We are due to consider ways to avoid causing any damage to the energy infrastructure. This is not in our interests. We, as the President said, are for the renewal in some form of a more acceptable Black Sea initiative for everyone. The Black Sea initiative was discussed as a priority in Riyadh. Our position is simple, and I have just roughly outlined it. We simply cannot take this person's word for it. We want the grain and fertilizer markets to be predictable so that no one tries to drive us away from this market, not only because we want to receive a legitimate profit in fair competition. We are concerned about the state of food security in African countries, other countries of the global South and East, which are affected by these Western games, suffer from unfair competition and face significant challenges in the market. And the prices now indeed are not ruinous, but they could be significantly lower if the West stopped interfering in the game, in the free play of market forces, which it idolized when it invited us all into this kingdom of globalization and freedom. But, as I already mentioned, we will need clear guarantees. And the guarantees can be, considering the sad experience of agreements just with Kyiv, the guarantees can only be the result of an order from Washington to Zelensky and this very team to act in this way and no other. And it seems to me our American partners have received this signal. They understand that only Washington can achieve positive results in stopping terrorist acts, stopping the shelling of civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure not related to the military-industrial complex. Because Europe has now gone down a completely different path. Europe is showing, just like in the times of Napoleon, in the times of Hitler, another ambition in the times of the Crimean War, another eagerness to inflict a strategic defeat on our country. And again, just like in those years, almost all European countries, with rare exceptions, have been mobilized. But these European countries are not yet physically fighting against us on Ukrainian territory. But without them, Ukraine would have long since suffered defeat, and the functioning of this Nazi regime would have been terminated. But still, by supplying Ukraine with weapons, you see both London and Paris, especially these two countries, or rather the two leaders, Starmer and Macron, with the support of such a chorus of not very powerful Baltic states and several other countries. They are not only talking about continuing to supply Ukraine with weapons, but also talk about some coalitions of the willing, about deploying a certain peacekeeping mission, or a mission to ensure Ukraine's security after a ceasefire. Or even deploying two missions in Ukraine, one as if on the border with the European Union and NATO, and the second from countries of the global but south. They mention India, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, even China is mentioned. But these dreamers undoubtedly prove their complete political incompetence with each passing day. But the desire to contain Russia, not just contain, but to defeat it, someone even said, Putin must be humiliated. This desire, as it turns out, historians can probably correct me, but my sense of history is that we've been through all this before. Both Napoleon and Hitler had the same goals. And to achieve these goals, well, Napoleon and Hitler conquered all of Europe. And in this case, all of Europe is mobilized. And how Europe, now led by Germany, starting with Ursula von der Leyen, begins with seriously consider the issue of remilitarization. For an astronomical hundreds of billions of euros in a situation where they have dire issues in the economy, in the social sphere, as a result of what their Biden administration has unleashed and sent to fight with the Russian Federation. They are experiencing deindustrialization, a huge number of problems. But perhaps this partly explains why they so fervently and passionately demand not to surrender Ukraine, demand to arm Ukraine, demand not even to mention that Ukraine should not join NATO and the European Union. Macron recently spoke on this topic. That is, they directly contradict the Trump administration, which, through the words of the president himself, through the words of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and through the words of Mark Usen. Walls, the advisor on NASP, clearly stated that preliminary negotiations on the parameters of the final settlement are currently underway. Trump clearly said that NATO should be forgotten and there was no need to even stir up this topic. But Biden made a colossal mistake and refused to listen to the Russian Federation, insisting that Ukraine will be in NATO, thus creating unacceptable threats for us. Waltz also said that Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, they said that territorial issues are key because the territories where referendums were held have always been Russian territories culturally, in terms of language, religion, and traditions. And people want to continue being associated with Russian culture, which the Kyiv regime is legislatively eradicating. That is, the rearmament that is necessary, as President Putin emphasized, the supply of weapons must be stopped. But Europe says, and Zelensky says, no, we will not take any right. Can America influence Europe today? The Trump administration, why is this not happening? It was said by both Trump and my team that NATO is taboo territories. It needs to be discussed. It's not about a piece of land, but about the people who live there and have spoken. For the fact that their future is connected with the Russian Federation. And the point is that weapons should not be supplied there. So on all 3 points. Firstly, Zelensky himself, after being rude to Trump in the White House, then went to London, where he was welcomed warmly. And upon returning to Kyiv, he started making even more bold statements, including rejecting both neutral status and the discussion of territories. No, give us everything. Give us everything. What does this mean? That you have banned everything Russian, including the canonical Orthodox Church, Ukrainian, which is a sister to the Russian Orthodox Church, including media, including education. Now there's a new bill in the Riyadh to prohibit speaking Russian during school breaks. Previously, it was only during lessons. And what? You want to return citizens to this country who in the referendum simply said, we are Russian, and if we lived with all our rights, we would be Russian citizens of Ukraine. And you are trying to exterminate us, both physically and legislatively. And in this situation, by the way, it turns out that Europe not only shows a front towards the analysis of Trump and his team that the territory without NATO needs to be discussed and resolved, but Europe also wants to egg on Zelensky himself. After all, when they talk about these forces, peacekeeping or security forces, the point is that, well, at the very least, the part that is currently controlled by the Kyiv regime or that will be controlled at the time of some agreement needs to be urgently taken under their wing, under the British, under the French, and no one talks about the fact that in this part of Ukraine, well, in the rest of Ukraine, which will return to its native harbor and has already returned, the rights of everyone. Both Russians and national minorities, linguistic, educational, cultural rights are fully ensured. But when the remainder of Ukraine, if it indeed remains in some form, will be taken under control by the security forces of NATO countries, it doesn't matter under which flag. No one is saying, and then we will strengthen democracy in the remaining territory. We will abolish racist laws, Russophobic ones that eradicate everything Russian. No one talks about this. And if so, then these security forces will be perpetuating the Nazi regime with a ban on everything that somehow reminds of Russian roots, of this country, which in fact came into existence thanks to the Russians.
Sergey Viktorovich, well, how can we negotiate at all if, for example, Putin agreed, yes, we don't hit energy targets, although we haven't done this for 30 days, yes, in a conversation with Trump, and yet something hits the oil depot in Kuban right away. It turns out to be some kind of vicious circle. How much patience do we need to have?
There are many more examples. And I said that this regime is incapable of making agreements.
This happened after the conversation the next day?
Not only incapable of making agreements, but I think that here it is already. Some kind of some new quality of these characters, the desire, well, not to deceive, but to spite, to openly and publicly do something unpleasant and disagreeable that directly contradicts what you were asked to do and you seem to agree to in order to spite. So, on March 11th, in Jeddah for the first time, four teams. The Kyiv regime stated that it agrees to a 30-day ceasefire, immediately and quickly transferred responsibility to the country of Russia, saying, let's agree immediately without any conditions. And all sorts of Macrons. Starmers, von der Leyens immediately started shouting, yes, 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 now the ball is in Putin's court. Even though just 3 days before they were all saying, no ceasefire, we need to arm Ukraine before sitting at the negotiation table so it can negotiate from a position of strength. They changed instantly their position as soon as the wind shifted. But on March 11th, when the Ukrainians announced and Zelensky said, okay, we are ready for a ceasefire, but now Putin must be forced. On that very day, they sent a record number of drones to the central regions of Russia, including Moscow, the Moscow region, about 340 drones, something that has never happened before. And the West swallowed it all. No one said, how dare you? We just agreed with you, and you publicly announced that you are ready for a ceasefire. And now you are waiting for Russia to respond to you accordingly. Thank you. 340 drones targeting all, exclusively civilian objects. Our air defense worked reliably, but we are observing the same thing now as the meeting in Riyadh was being prepared. The American administration, we agreed, initially based on the understanding between Putin and Trump that our experts from the USA and Russia would go. But apparently in Washington, the guys, such active ones, want to as soon as possible something, to secure something, and they invited there as well. As you know, and as you are probably aware, the Ukrainians, who indeed arrived a day earlier and who stayed after our experts left and who remained there even after. Well, just between you and me, I personally believe, you see, I don't think it's a big secret in the contacts on the eve of this Riyadh meeting with Washington. It actually felt like the Americans wanted to somehow seat the Ukrainians and Russians together in adjacent rooms, and in order to effectively and successfully conduct shuttle diplomacy between them, and to produce some kind of unified text. But we explained once again what our presidents discussed. We have an absolutely clear understanding that they agreed to proceed in a way that ensures everything is reliable and that no more unfounded documents are accepted, and not even unfounded ones. And even for documents that are accepted with certain guarantees, our American colleagues should take control over the implementation and adherence to these guarantees by the Kyiv regime. This is what is being discussed now. And Europe is trying in every way to undermine the role of the USA in resolving the Ukrainian crisis, and does not want to resolve it based on eliminating the root causes. The root cause, as I mentioned, is NATO, the extermination of the rights of the Russian population, the eradication of everything related to Russia, both legally and physically.
Meanwhile, Witkoff quite optimistically states that a truce will be reached, he mentioned, in 2 weeks. Now he says by Easter, which is in a month. Do you share his optimism? I know you don't get paid for optimism.
Well, you understand. Thank you. often compared habits, traditions of the Soviet Union with what is now also manifesting in some Western countries. We had the 5-year plan completed in 4 years. Well, there you go. After we rejected godlessness, well, by Easter, probably could have been by Christmas, but here by Easter, I wouldn't make such predictions. I understand Steve Ugitkov's desire. He is a very smart, energetic person. And he just thinks that everyone should understand the basic things in his view. And he understood the essence of this conflict, judging by his statements, judging by his interview with Tucker Carlson. But he significantly overestimates the elites of European countries who want to hang on to Zelensky like a stone to prevent him from showing any weakness. Yes, and he himself does not want to show weakness. He understands that his days are numbered, that his bright image, as he tried to build it among the people, has long faded. Except for that part of the population that reflects radical, ultra-right, Ivanchist, Bandera views, there are quite a few such people there as well.
All these years, Russia-USA relations have been steadily deteriorating during Trump's first term. They have reached the lowest point. Why is Trump now so sharply changing the paradigm of our relations with Russia?
I think he has gained, during his first term, extremely valuable experience, knowledge, insight, and understanding, especially regarding the necessity of having his own team and comprehension. Relations deteriorated to a decisive degree because during Trump's first term, random people gathered around him. In America, analysts say that the reason for this was, in general, Trump's belief that he wouldn't be allowed through to the presidency, and he wasn't very well prepared for the first term. That's why there were people who betrayed him. He recently recalled both his then vice president and the Secretary of State about the National Security Advisor, who still criticizes him very rudely. I would even say harshly. Therefore, Trump is a decisive person, and when he made the decision for himself to take such that revenge for the previous elections when Biden won with the votes of millions of dead people, or people who sent their ballots by mail. In large numbers, he decided to settle the score with this and finally get what he is entitled to by history and the will of the American people. And he achieved this while already running the U.S. campaign. The speed with which he got his team approved in the Senate, of course, indicates that he had been forming it for a long time. This is a team of like-minded individuals. They are not shy about speaking directly about things about which they agree among themselves and which, as they believe, reflect the interests, the national interest of the American people. We, as we will add, we were in Riyadh with Yuri Ushakov, meeting with Marco Rubio and Marco Waltz. I already mentioned in some interview, Rubio stated that all of Trump's foreign policy is the American national interest, but at the same time, he understands that other countries, especially great powers, also have national interests. And therefore, fundamentally, they do not always coincide. In most cases, they do not coincide. But when they do coincide, it would be criminal not to use it. This coincidence is for materialization into some mutually beneficial joint material projects in the economy, in energy, in infrastructure, in logistics. And the second thought was that when these interests do not coincide, which is the majority of cases, responsible powers are obliged to do everything necessary to prevent the degradation of these differences into confrontation, especially into a hot confrontation. We supported this approach wholeheartedly. I believe that these are the principles on which we build our relations with any countries. These are, by the way, the same principles we build with Russia, which lie in the relationship between the USA and China. They have a lot of disagreements. They very often engage in a tough exchange of pleasantries. And regarding the Taiwan Strait, regarding the South China Sea. The Chinese say, we condemn the fact that the USA and other Western countries consider Taiwan as an independent state. We are committed to the peaceful reunification of the motherland. But if necessary, we are ready to achieve this great goal of the great Chinese people by other means. The Americans respond, don't you dare, and so on. But despite this, their dialogue has never been interrupted. And I believe that what we experienced under Biden is an anomaly. This does not do credit to politicians, especially those with experience like Biden. He was proud of this experience. When you suddenly, like a child in kindergarten, turn away from a girl or a girl from a boy saying, I won't be friends with you. We won't play together, as if in the yard. It's silly. Therefore, the fact that now, despite serious disagreements, we have resumed dialogue is normal, a return to normalcy. And he owed. Such a dialogue is all the more necessary because not only is Ukraine, Biden artificially brought the Ukrainian issue to the top of the international agenda. Many of my friends told us that this topic did not deserve that the reaction was super hypertrophied to the special military operation indeed was certainly initiated 10 years after we began warning that this would not, in fact, lead to anything truly beneficial, guys. After the coup, after being drawn into NATO, we warned at every corner. And even back in 2007 in Munich, Putin spoke about how it was brewing. Such a phenomenon as the impunity of the West, its sense of excessive completeness and excessive exclusivity. All of this later materialized. But now, well, of course, there are disagreements, but the interest, let's say, to restore normal energy supply to Europe. Is this only in the interest of the USA and Russia? There's talk about the Nord Streams, but it would probably be interesting if the Americans use their influence on Europe and make it not refuse Russian gas. But this is already some kind of surrealism, you understand? Europe is now paying several times more. Businesses are paying more than American businesses for energy resources. And at the same time, people like, I don't remember, it's Haver, Kabiki, those Ursulas. Pistorius, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the letters correctly. In general, they all say no way. We will not allow the Nord Streams to be restored. These are either sick people or suicides. And therefore, it's normal when there's a conversation. As you know, the prospect was discussed of removing obstacles for mutually beneficial, I emphasize again, joint economic projects. This includes energy, space, and the Arctic, by the way. We are two Arctic powers. So we are not deluding ourselves. We have been led too deeply astray by Biden's partners in our bilateral relations. But the fact that Trump's people want these relations to be made mutually beneficial, where possible mutually respectful where we disagree and to prevent our disagreements, the disagreements of the two largest nuclear powers, from escalating into confrontation. Here we have a consensus.
We are not deluding. We will be different in these relations. What mistakes which might have been made before when building relationships will we definitely not make anymore?
Well, trust but verify. This is the great commandment of Ronald Reagan, and Trump recalled it. And we will not forget it. Therefore, here is a combination of various elements and components. A civilizational understanding of the current stage of development, when national interests need to be prioritized, when it is clear that globalization was destroyed by efforts, including those of the previous administration, including when the dollar began to be used as a weapon, even before he became president. Trump said after the elections that Biden made a colossal mistake with non-crime, using the dollar to punish individual countries, and accordingly, not only those whom he tried to punish by depriving them of the ability to use the dollar, but others also began to take notice. And now Russia is being punished, now Iran is being punished, Venezuela and some others. What if next time one of us is not liked? Do you remember Biden then? How he insulted Saudi Arabia, then had to go, and make amends. Everyone roughly thinks the same, that if suddenly some administration in the USA and each of their administrations can cancel everything that the previous one decided, what the previous one agreed upon, comes in and suddenly doesn't like it, someone from those who are not currently on the blacklist. But perhaps in this case, it's better to play it safe and not necessarily create your own currency, but use national currencies in transactions, not the dollar and not the euro. By the way, because Europeans are even less predictable people. Some payment platforms, like BRICS, are currently being discussed, and this process can no longer be stopped. But, of course, Trump is a man of action. He doesn't like to philosophize. He likes to solve problems. And, when he said Greenland, it's absolutely essential for the United States for security. I believe that we discussed this with the Americans, and I have the complete impression that they understood it. And such comparisons are very important for them, that for security, for the legitimate security interests of Russia, Ukraine, is several orders of magnitude more important than Greenland is for ensuring the security of the United States. They understand this. By the way, regarding Greenland, it's a disgraceful phenomenon. Once again, the new, now NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, when he was received at the White House, he, after this or during the conversation or later at the press conference, spoke about it, and we very much hope that the United States will not involve NATO in any way. In the context of Greenland, it turns out that the person who is obliged to safeguard the interests of member countries, and Denmark, which currently owns Greenland, is a member country of NATO, and who is obliged to prevent violations of the territorial integrity of member countries. He says, yes, I am dealing with this, but regarding Greenland, I don't even want to comment. And yet, regarding Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, and will never be a NATO member, he's not shy to express his opinion. We demand that no one dares to violate Ukraine's territorial integrity with even a finger. Denmark's territorial integrity, yes, please, as much as you want. But don't touch Ukraine. Well, a ridiculous and pathetic person.
The last question. The Americans want to involve China in the New START treaty. How realistic does this idea seem to you?
You know, it's up to the People's Republic of China to decide, of course, as we have said many times, Beijing has repeatedly, when this topic has surfaced in the public domain, made comments. The comments boil down to the fact that the arsenal, China's nuclear arsenal, is incomparable with the nuclear arsenals of the USA and Russia. When a comparable level is reached, then it will be possible to think about how to proceed further. A nuclear power will interact. We, as you know, are still working within the nuclear five. At the level of representatives of the P5, there are also meetings at the deputy minister level. At our initiative, an online summit was held at the beginning of 2022, in January, when the Gorbachev-Reagan formula that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought was translated into a five-party format, and the entire nuclear five reiterated this formula. But we are not against continuing work in this format. By the way, it has never stopped. Mainly, confidence-building measures are discussed there, things that are not related to reductions or even discussions of the quantitative parameters of nuclear arsenals. Their trust and the avoidance of any incidents. But when Trump speaks, and before him, by the way, Biden said that we should involve China in these negotiations, our position was, well, first of all, it's up to China. How China decides, we will fully respect its choice. But if we are to talk about expanding the circle of participants, then what about France and Britain? Britain and the USA are members of the same alliance, which during Biden's years and even before Biden didn't say much good about us, and during Biden's years simply declared us the main threat. If we are the main threat and they tell us, I would like to talk with you, but these two countries should not be touched. Well, that's unfair. That's unfair. Therefore, the fact that the Russian-American dialogue on strategic stability needs to be restored, we certainly agree with that. Undoubtedly, this can indeed only be done based on a return to the principles that underpin the treaty on strategic offensive arms, and which were reflected in its preamble, including the link between strategic offensive and strategic defensive arms, such as, for instance, in particular, and specifically, including, for example, and notably including mutual respect, and the agreement to conduct affairs solely on the basis of equality. And, of course, as long as we are doctrinally considered an enemy, essentially, what kind of stability can we talk about? Therefore, we are in favor of negotiations in all directions. Thank you. We are talking about hockey, about football, by the way. These are not just games. These are exactly what people want. If in sports, the overwhelming majority of Russian and American athletes, as well as athletes from any other country, including Western countries, consider it absolutely abnormal what is happening regarding the exclusion of Russian and Belarusian athletes, and regarding how a man, under the guise of, or rather calling himself a woman, enters a boxing match and beats a real woman. This is what the Trump administration, the realization of the inadmissibility of distorting human archaic nature and traditional values, religious, cultural, moral. This is very refreshing. It should have an effect on the entire Western society. I hope that is what will happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you.